And welcome to our special coverage of the passing of President Jimmy Carter. I'm Joe St. George. President Carter, born James Earl Carter Jr., the peanut farmer who became the nation's 39th president, the longest living American president. He celebrated his 100th birthday this past year. President Carter leaves behind a legacy far greater than his single term in the White House. Over the course of the next hour, we'll share stories of Carter's impact around the globe, from a village in the Congo to Clinton, Massachusetts, and the Musicians Village in New Orleans. These places and the people who live there have lasting memories of President Carter's compassion and humanity. But we start in Carter's beloved Atlanta, Georgia, where Jimmy Carter served as the 76th governor and now the home of the Carter Center, helping mitigate conflicts and promote democracy around the world. It's where his grandson, Jason Carter, spoke with Scripps News correspondent Alexa Liacco to reflect on the life of the longest living American president.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
It's not that he is larger than life, in fact. He's a regular person. He has foibles.
Jason Carter has a lot of stories about the man he called Pawpaw.
He'd be in his wood shop, literally in a t-shirt and Crocs.
Hey, presidents like Crocs too, you know?
He has things that he does that we're all just like, oh, geez, Pawpaw, you know, like. And the thing to me that is the most incredible about them is how little they changed.
Over the years, he has unofficially taken on the role of family storyteller.
My grandmother doesn't need a eulogy. Her life was a sermon.
From eulogizing his late grandmother last November to now remembering Georgia's favorite son.
We all have this remarkable power, and some of us are put in positions to be able to use all of it. And he got one of those opportunities, and he took enormous advantage of it.
Very good.
Carter's faith was his North Star. Faith in the Atlanta Braves, faith in America, combined with a love of homemade caramel cake and Rosalind.
When my grandmother passed, we thought for sure that he was finished, right? I know that he was proud at that moment that he made it to the end with her and for her.
In October, President Carter turned 100.
Happy 100th birthday, President Carter.
And tributes poured in from around the world. Carter's biggest legacy is the work being done by the Carter Center.
When you don't have guinea worm, then the children can go to school, the farmers can plant their crops, and the entire economic status of a village and a community and a nation can be helped.
For 40 years, it's taken action to eradicate the guinea worm, a disease passed by drinking contaminated water that once had 3.5 million cases per year. The number of cases recorded in 2023, 13. Paige Alexander is the Carter Center CEO.
He was a true Renaissance man, but he didn't see himself that way. He just saw himself as an American. He grew up without shoes for the first several years of his life and didn't start wearing them until he went to school. He saw in villagers at the end of the road the same thing he felt as growing up in Plains, Georgia, and in his town of, his village of 600 people.
It's a perfect testament to the fact that this worm, this horrible disease is no more.
But in the last few years, Carter realized spreading small-town care and honesty was needed here, too.
Let's get to the polls.
In 2020, in the wake of unrest spreading across the nation, the Carter Center began investing in democracy by encouraging Americans to get educated on the issues and to get out and vote.
Right now, everybody feels nervous about the way our political system at home has been run down and how many people have lost faith in that political system. But I think the fundamental fact of my grandfather's sort of grounding is his faith in the American people. That faith is one that I share, and it really keeps me going even in these moments.
It was faith that propelled a life of service, and it's faith Carter hopes will build an American democracy stronger than his grandfather ever dreamed possible. Alexa Liacco, Scripps News, Atlanta.
Those close to former President Carter have said that his goal was to live to see the eradication of the guinea worm. The Democratic Republic of Congo was recently certified free of the disease. Reporting from Kinshasa, here's correspondent Chris Ochamringa.
A daily routine for women and children in remote parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Streams, ponds, and rivers are the main sources of water for drinking, bathing, and cooking for many here. More than 60 years ago, Congolese were falling sick of a disease transmitted by drinking unfiltered water from such areas. The ailment was known as the guinea worm disease.
Avec le système de santé qui était à l'époque,
our old health system detected many cases of the guinea worm disease in our country during the colonial period. Some reports put the figure at about 518 cases.
Although rarely fatal, the guinea worm disease leaves sufferers unable to function normally for long. Once the water flea enters the body, it grows into a long worm that comes out through the arm or leg. In 1986, international health experts decided to eliminate the guinea worm disease. The campaign was led by the Carter Center, founded by former President Jimmy Carter. Back then, about 3.5 million cases of guinea worm were reported annually in 21 countries in Africa and Asia. In 2022, the World Health Organization certified the DRC as free of the guinea worm disease. Congolese officials hailed the NGO of President Carter for their efforts in providing technical and financial assistance.
The Carter Center is the sole funder that supports efforts to eradicate the guinea worm disease in our country, but the funds go through the World Health Organization.
International experts are now on a mission of eradicating the disease from the 6 remaining countries: Angola, Chad, Ethiopia, Mali, South Sudan, and Sudan. The DRC has been working closely with the experts from the Carter Center to prevent the emergence of new cases from neighboring countries. Health officials in the Democratic Republic of Congo are still monitoring suspected cases of the guinea worm disease after the country was declared free of the infection. Posters like this one offering a cash reward of $1,000 to people who report cases that are confirmed are meant to help them identify and treat the disease promptly. No one in the DRC has received the $1,000 so far because all the suspected cases reported have turned out to be different ailments. The Carter Center has been supporting the DRC with funding for monitoring the disease through the World Health Organization. But Congolese health experts want that to change.
What we want is to work directly with the Carter Center, especially in this post-certification time. We need to strengthen surveillance internally and along our borders.
There is no medicine or vaccine for treating the guinea worm disease. Health experts urge communities to avoid drinking water from unfiltered sources. President Carter worked tirelessly to eradicate the disease. Before undergoing treatment for brain cancer, he said he would like to see the last guinea worm die before he does. And with only 13 human cases of the disease reported worldwide in 2022, it's clear his aspiration is getting closer. Chris Ochamringa, Scripps News, Kinshasa.
Coming up on our special coverage of the passing of President Jimmy Carter, famous for being a Baptist Sunday school teacher and recognized as the first born-again president, we'll take a look at President Carter's faith. That's next. Dubbed the first born-again Christian president, those who knew Jimmy Carter say he lived by the mantra to do the right thing no matter what. Scripps News national correspondent Amber Strong explores how his faith guided his life's work.
Known for his humanitarian efforts, Jimmy Carter was brought up in the Southern Baptist tradition, his faith influenced by his mother Lillian and the black churches he attended in Georgia.
He was virtually the only little white boy, and all his playmates were African Americans.
Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and Carter biographer Kai Bird says despite finding religion early, Carter was born again in 1966 after losing the Georgia governor's race.
He was rather shocked by this, and this plunged him into rather deep depression. He was, and it made him question his faith.
His belief reignited by his sister.
She said what you need to do is what Christ had his disciples do. Take your loss and let it strengthen you. ask God to give you guidance on what you can do in the future. You have a good life ahead of you.
Byrd says Carter did use his faith to guide him through future political endeavors, leading him to tough decisions.
The Panama Canal Treaty, which was very costly. 7 Democratic senators who voted for the treaties lost their next elections. It was a very unpopular political move, but Carter thought it was the right thing to do.
An outspoken Christian comfortable in both predominantly black and white churches, Carter won over Christian voters in 1976 who were hungry for his promise of integrity above all after the Nixon years. But his re-election campaign and his faith were challenged by the newly emerging evangelical right.
These white evangelicals were fleeing the public schools and setting up these private white academies and claiming that they were church institutions and therefore entitled to tax exemption. And Carter said, no. You're doing this for all the wrong reasons, and it's not a Christian thing to do. So he alienated that vote over specifically that issue.
America did not invent human rights. In a very real sense, it's the other way around. Human rights invented America.
After leaving office, he founded the Carter Center alongside his wife Rosalind, an extension to his work in office, working to eradicate guinea worm disease, a debilitating illness caused by parasites in parts of Africa, and tools in hand, building homes for those in need as the face of Habitat for Humanity.
You know, Carter said at the time this is likely to be a week we'll never forget. Well, we had no idea.
Rob DeRocker was executive director on what would become Carter's first Habitat for Humanity project in New York City in 1984. Telling Scripps News, Carter was moved by the people of the neighborhood during a visit to the city.
He looks north and he sees Midtown Manhattan. He looks in the backyard of this rubble-strewn lot, and there's an elderly woman cooking her breakfast over an open fire. He said, if there's anything I can do to help you here, just let him know. And that's when I just blurted out, well, Mr. President, thank you. Maybe you can send some volunteer carpenters from your church or something.
A few months later, Carter and his team showed up ready to work.
He's the first one on the job with everyone else. One day we took the subway, and then they had to pry him away at the end of the day.
In his lifetime, Carter wrote dozens of books, many centered on his faith. In his book, Faith, Journey for All, he called on Christians to be active in politics, writing, Christians are called to plunge into the life of the world and to inject the moral and ethical values of our faith into the processes of governing. Perhaps Carter's most evident dedication of his faith can be found in the pews of this Plains, Georgia church. Well into his 90s, he could still occasionally be found teaching Sunday school at Maranatha Baptist, crowds lining up to hear him speak.
Our natural choice should always be the words and the actions and example and the authority of Jesus Christ, filled with love, filled with justice.
Today, the church's website features testimonies from people touched by Carter's Bible studies over the years. Most reflect on Carter's challenges to the church to commit small acts of kindness. His niece remembering one of her uncle's quotes in a recent service.
My faith demands that I do whatever I can, wherever I can, whenever I can, for as long as I can, with whatever I have to try to make a difference.
In one of his final lessons, he remarked, it's incompatible for any Christian not to believe in life after death, echoing similar sentiments after his cancer diagnosis in 2015.
I've had a wonderful life. I've had thousands of friends, and I've had an exciting and adventurous and gratifying existence. So I was surprisingly at ease. But now I feel, that it's in the hands of God, whom I worship. And I'll be prepared for anything that comes.
Amber Strong, Scripps News, Washington.
I'm Chris Conti, and as we continue to remember the life of President Jimmy Carter, we're bringing you here to Clinton, Massachusetts, where President Carter visited back in 1977. It was a visit that still stays with one local family.
I mean, just the fact that he stayed at someone's house.
Oh, yeah.
Like, could you imagine a president doing that today?
No.
It just wouldn't happen.
Not at all. No, would not happen.
We show you why President Carter picked the Thompson family's home at random, then spent the night back in 1977. We show you how this town and family are looking back on his legacy in that historic visit.
As we continue to look back on his life, one family is reflecting on the time President Carter came to stay with them in their Massachusetts home. Chris Conti shows us what made that visit such a memorable one.
This is Clinton, Massachusetts. It's not really famous for much, except for back in 1977 when President Jimmy Carter came here. It was a visit that still stays with one local family to this day.
We're just going second floor, but I am going to have to climb a ladder to drag down some stuff.
If you want to know a thing or two about history, Terry Engano is your guy.
The place may look a little messy or a little dirty.
I met Terry inside the Clinton, Massachusetts Historical Society.
Watch Terry climb the ladder. Watch Terry fall from the ladder. It was quite the happening.
The items we were looking for have been sitting on a shelf for years. One by one, box by box, Terry dutifully handed me pieces of history.
So you've been saving this stuff for a while?
Oh, yes. Oh, most definitely.
And then it was time to open up the past.
Yeah, we have a little bit of everything here. It's amazing.
The year was 1977. It was the first year of Jimmy Carter's presidency.
Of course, the Carter T-shirt.
Carter was looking to get out of Washington. So advisors picked every town USA, or in this case, Clinton, Massachusetts.
Stood outside to see the craziness all over the place. The Boston Herald American.
And that is where Terry Engano, a man who preserves history, was witness to it.
He was shaking hands with everybody.
President Carter needed a place to stay during his trip, so he chose this house. It belonged to the Thompson family, complete strangers to the president at the time. But with the entire family at home, President Carter spent the night. The next morning, running behind, he wrote the Thompson kids a note, reading, "To the teacher, please excuse Jane for being late to school. She had a guest in her house."
I mean, just the fact that he stayed at someone's house.
Oh, yeah.
Like, could you imagine a president doing that today?
No. Yeah.
It just wouldn't happen.
Not at all. No, would not happen.
So what type of man was he? He wouldn't sleep in the master bedroom. He, specifically said, put me in a guest room. He did everything he could to not disrupt family life.
Dan Tenor recently moved into the Thompson house that holds plenty of history.
Say what you will about any particular president's success or shortcomings in office, you always respect the office. And the fact that the House once played host to a president is a big deal. Or at least it is to us.
The entire event was front-page news in this small town for days.
This visit for President Carter was part of a tour that he did in an effort to connect with the average American citizen.
But one voice, particularly the voice of the American president, can set a standard for the world.
President Carter even held a town hall during his stay.
But I think over time, I think people started to realize that the character of the man was something that maybe we haven't seen since.
More than anything, each piece of Carter's visit to Clinton, Massachusetts carries with it a reminder of what were simpler times.
I mean, what an experience.
Oh, yeah. Can you imagine
having the president stay in your home?
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't happen today anyway, just because of security.
As a nation reflects back on the life of the 39th president, there's a piece of history one family and one town will always have.
Part of our history we'll never forget.
Chris Conti, Scripps News, Clinton, Massachusetts.
Much has been said about President Jimmy Carter's global legacy, but for some, it is deeply personal. I'm Maya Rodriguez in New Orleans, where we're about to take you on a journey to a neighborhood and the people who live there, who say President Carter came to their aid when they needed it most.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
As we look back on the life and legacy of the 39th President Jimmy Carter, we can't help but look at his record when it comes to race relations and how it will be remembered. Here's Scripps News correspondent Tammy Estwick.
What's the worst problem that your neighbors and y'all face? Jobs?
Jimmy Carter's record on race relations is a tough nut to crack.
I think with almost any president, there's often a mixed bag. He was someone, I think, who had a lot of hopes and dreams.
Well, he's probably one of the most misunderstood presidents we've had in history. First president to be elected from the Deep South since 1844.
Carter's roots are deep in the state of Georgia, where even now race issues are front and center. His mother taught him to treat black people the same as white people. His father, however, is seen as having his feet planted deep in maintaining the status quo of segregation. Jerry Mitchell is a journalist with the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting at Mississippi Today.
I think Jimmy Carter, in a sense, was that symbol that white Southerner was able to break free from his past. And the thing we also have to mention about Jimmy Carter is his faith, because faith was huge to him. And he understood that faith meant that you accept people across the color lines.
Political analyst Dr. Silas Lee says when it came to running for office, Carter used his Southern charm to propel his career.
He was able to basically attract a lot of African-American support from people in Georgia. That's what elected him governor. And he was able to convert that to support on a national level.
The time for racial discrimination is over.
The applause was not abundant. However, Mitchell believes hearing this at Carter's 1971 inauguration as governor of Georgia gave some Southerners and others attached to racist attitudes a kind of emancipation.
I think that's true because we were bound to this racist ideology and thinking, and we were freed too. I don't think we usually think in those terms, but we were freed from that hate. We were freed from that fear. We were freed from that kind of, poisonous thinking.
Some historians say Carter used the black vote to get elected, but they say when Carter became president, he could have done more. Lee says it's a little more complicated than that.
Think about the timing. 1976, we were going through some, almost like now, some tense social and economic times. And it was a challenging period.
Carter was the one that kind of began to break down the walls of having, more African Americans serving in those, very top positions.
He did elevate African Americans to positions of authority and power as president.
Lee points to Eleanor Holmes Norton, who Carter appointed to head the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. Now a congresswoman, she represents Washington, D.C. Civil rights activist Andrew Young became the country's first black ambassador to the UN and later was elected mayor of Atlanta.
Cliff Alexander, Secretary of the Army. He was a supporter of HBCU funding, as well as getting some support for and developing support for policies and programs to expand opportunities for African American businesses.
Through putting black people in important positions, he named 57 judges of color to the federal courts. Carter gave black viewpoints more seats at the table.
History is going to remember Jimmy Carter as someone of conviction and courage to stand up for the rights of everyone, especially African Americans, when the social climate was not always conducive to that.
Tammy Estwick, Scripps News, New Orleans.
Jimmy Carter's life after his 4 years in the White House included a decades-long involvement with Habitat for Humanity. Scripps News national correspondent Chris Stewart gives us some background on the effect it has had on the Carters over the years, the organization, and the people who volunteer.
Since 1976, Habitat for Humanity has worked to provide safe, affordable homes for people in 70 countries. Jimmy and Rosalind Carter began volunteering with the nonprofit in 1984. The former president jogged by a New York City Habitat project and was inspired. Since then, they've raised funds for the organization and been hands-on construction volunteers.
It's a matter of deep emotion for me.
I know what a transformation can be in a family's life to get a decent home.
According to Habitat, the Carters have worked alongside 100,000 volunteers in 14 countries, helping to build, renovate, or repair more than 4,000 homes.
There's no way to describe the effect having a house has on a family. It adds so much to their self-esteem.
Their commitment inspired others to get involved.
Every time that I am at a Carter build, I feel like it changes my life every time. Because you just got to see it for yourself, and all you got to do is go one time and you're in, you're hooked.
So to get to see the genesis of this community is a remarkable sensorial experience.
The Carters ended their on-site involvement on Habitat projects in 2019. But after a 3-year break, their namesake project returned. Habitat resumed the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter Work Project in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Habitat for Humanity is back on the road.
Garth Brooks and Tricia Yearwood are taking up the hosting duties. Chris Stewart, Scripps News, Atlanta.
4,390. That's the number of homes that President Jimmy Carter personally worked on during his decades of volunteering with Habitat for Humanity. Behind every home, there's a story of the person who lives there, the struggles they overcame to become homeowners, and their personal connection to the man who was America's 39th president. For Michael Harris, life is about the simple joys found in it. Sitting on his front porch, playing his guitar.
I say let the music play.
Harris is a New Orleans musician who has played around the world, but his greatest second act may be his role of homeowner in a New Orleans neighborhood known as Musicians Village.
To be a musician, living in a place called a Musicians Village, that's like further affirmation of the importance of what we do.
Harris lost everything during Hurricane Katrina, but found a way home and more.
That's how I wound up meeting President Carter.
Habitat for Humanity helped build the more than 80 homes that make up Musicians Village, a neighborhood specifically designed to help New Orleans musicians who lost their homes in Hurricane Katrina. President Jimmy Carter and his wife, Rosalind, were right there, side by side with residents, rebuilding this community one nail at a time.
I shook his hand, and he was just a very warm, approachable, accessible person, very humble man.
Somebody that I know came by and said, yeah, Jimmy Carter's in there. And I was like, oh my God, that's so cool. He's here. He's actually, he's Mr. Habitat.
In the living room of her Musicians Village home, singer-songwriter Margie Perez keeps a framed photo of her meeting President Carter during the neighborhood build.
He was just so kind and just the little guy wearing an Atlanta Braves baseball cap, and he felt like one of us. From the day he left his presidency, he's just been putting himself towards service in making communities better.
He was very hands-on. He would get the hammer out and actually do the work.
Jay Huffstatler with the New Orleans area Habitat for Humanity says President Carter made 3 separate trips after Hurricane Katrina, working on Habitat for Humanity homes in the region.
He's our most famous volunteer. A lot of folks think that President Carter runs Habitat when you talk to him, but we just like to tell him that, hey, he's our best volunteer that we have. He makes sure that he's making a difference in the communities across the United States and across the globe.
Back in Musicians Village, Michael Harris says he looks at his neighborhood with gratitude for everyone who took the time and put in the work to make it a reality, including President Carter.
I have a place to call home. It is one of the best feelings in the world. And it was all because of people like President Carter. I'm a living example of what he stands for as far as public service and changing lives. It changed my life.
Ensuring President Carter's legacy, much like Musicians Village, will live on. Maya Rodriguez, Scripps News, New Orleans.
As our special coverage continues, coming up, Commander-in-Teacher. Even as Commander-in-Chief, President Carter still found time to teach Sunday school. Recordings and photos of Jimmy Carter's tenure have been discovered in a D.C. church basement. Well, there are tidbits of history everywhere in our nation's capital, sometimes in unexpected places. Scripps News national correspondent Amber Strong uncovered a unique piece of Jimmy Carter's past buried deep in a church basement.
In a service attended by the President of the United States.
In a box in the basement of this D.C. church lies a glimpse into presidential history.
They went around to each of the tables and spoke to each individual a word or two, which was very flattering. Other folks had
Photos and audio recordings of President Jimmy Carter, who, despite his role as leader of the free world, got up on Sunday mornings and made his way here.
He may have had many more duties, a greater amount of duties, but he never forgot his upbringing.
Even though his reputation was known, longtime member Shirley McBeath and Pastor Julie Pennington Russell say Carter still went through the steps of officially joining the church.
The process was at a particular time in the worship service, you would walk forward and let the pastor know, God is leading me to join here, and then you get introduced to the congregation. And so they actually did that here.
Oftentimes when a president attends a church, the goal is to be inconspicuous, but not the Carters. Their goal was to really plug in and to be of service, and that meant taking their seat right here, front and center.
He chose that pew because from that seat he had a direct view of the stained glass image of George Washington Carver, who of course was the other peanut mogul.
The Carter kids were also involved. Amy Carter was baptized here, often joining the other kids for lock-ins and sleepovers.
She got to spend the night in their home, and she got to be upstairs and the Secret Service gentleman slept on the couch in the family room.
McBeath also remembers the banquet dinner thrown for the couple's class.
Here they are.
Going through old photos for the first time with Scripps News.
Where's President Carter? Yes, President Carter right there.
During his presidency, Carter attended service here about 70 times, splitting his time between tough presidential decisions and teaching the church's couples class in the balcony.
As you get this free gift of God through peace, through prayer, you have an obligation to exemplify the teachings of Christ.
The way he taught it, you just could not miss a word that he had to say.
His style was to take a little portion of Scripture and then to expound upon that and to talk about not only the biblical background, but to try and connect it to people's lives.
Sometimes those lessons gave a tiny glimpse into his presidency.
Just 7 days after he had accomplished the Middle East peace accords with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, he was in the balcony teaching his Sunday school class.
We read in the newspapers about those who try great things and flop. And we don't often admire them for their great attempts at high achievement. And all of us have that tendency to want to be careful, not to get out on a limb and endanger our stature. It's better to be a safe, mediocre nonentity than to be a highly publicized failure.
But it was his words after losing the 1980 election that resonated with members here. Carter simply saying he wanted to be remembered, not as a great president, but as the best Sunday school teacher ever.
He gives us a picture of someone who, whether in the spotlight of national and global affairs or in the tiny little town of Plains, he has been a Christ follower. And I just love that about him, and Mrs. Carter as well.
Paul said, "This is my joy and my crown. When my life is ended, this is what I want to leave as a culmination of all my effort."
Amber Strong, Scripps News, Washington.
Coming up, in the 1970s and 1980s, Jimmy Carter was considered the ultimate newcomer to lead the federal government. A conversation with former ABC News White House correspondent Sam Donaldson on Jimmy Carter, a self-described Washington outsider. In 2023, Scripps News national correspondent Clayton Sandell sat down for a conversation with Sam Donaldson, a former White House reporter who followed Jimmy Carter's political career from the early campaign days in Iowa to the end of his single term in the Oval Office. Donaldson reflects on how different Americans' sense of politics was in 1980.
Ultimately, what do you think Jimmy Carter's greatest legacy will be? I think Carter will go down in history much better than he was treated by the voters in 1980 when he failed in re-election, because of what he accomplished as president that was not recognized at the time because of the problems that also existed, and because of the great work he and his wife Rosalind did for all the years after that, helping people with no self-aggrandizement, helping people not being greedy for money, helping people with the Carter Center and everything that they did around the world to eradicate disease, to help make peace in other countries, to preside over things that just were good. I think his legacy will be the greatest president we ever had in the terms of humanity. And after all, humanity is what it's all about. Presidents who don't have Washington experience prior to that are behind the 8 ball because they don't know how the town works. Not that they're not good people with good ideas for the country and not people who know something about politics, but Washington is unique. So when Jimmy Carter came with Hamilton Jordan and with Jody Powell and all the other Georgia boys, they didn't know how to operate.
And that caused a lot of friction with Congress.
It caused a lot of friction. And he depumped the presidency at first.
Yeah.
I actually saw him as the White House correspondent. For the first 2 or 3 weeks, he'd go out to visit friends in the evening, not official. He'd have his motorcade stop at the red lights. This is the President of the United States. He didn't have the flags on, and he sold the yacht, that was okay.
And he didn't want Hail to the Chief being played.
He didn't want Hail. People finally got to him and said, look, we want our president to be better than we are. We don't want the guy next door, who we like very much, but you got to be someone who understands the pomp and ceremony. So he finally got on board and did that. Carter went to India, his first world tour after becoming president, many months afterwards. And the Indians took him to a small village near Delhi, where every day they dumped cow manure into a pit so it could make methane gasoline, and the methane gas would light the lamps of the village street. And this was during the time of energy crisis, and Carter was pushing, we have to do something about an energy crisis that's looming ahead. So we were standing on the edge of this manure pit, and I said jocularly to the President of the United States, "Sir, if I fell in, you'd pull me out, wouldn't you?" He looked at me and said, "Well, certainly." After a decent interval.
A life well lived, remembered by family, friends, colleagues, constituents. One last remembrance for the boy from Plains, Georgia. We leave you with a look back at the life and legacy of the president who lived to be 100 years of age. Here's Scripps News political director Andrew Rafferty.
From Plains, Georgia to the presidency, Jimmy Carter remembered for his humility in both victory and defeat.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt.
A self-described Washington outsider, Carter was swept into office in 1976 on a promise to bring honesty to a White House still reeling after Watergate.
I believe in the greatness of our country, and I believe the American people are ready for a change in Washington.
And just as remarkable as his years in office was a biography that got him there. A peanut farmer from rural Georgia, Carter's background was unlike any commander-in-chief that came before him.
Although I've had a good chance to get an education as an engineer and a scientist, nobody in my family before my generation ever had a chance to finish high school. We've always worked for a living.
Eager to see the world beyond Georgia, Carter knew at a young age he wanted to join the Navy and earn a degree from the Naval Academy in 1946. While attending the academy, he fell in love with Rosalind Smith, a friend of his sister's. They married shortly after his graduation, beginning a partnership that would span more than 3/4 of a century. Carter's career in the Navy advanced quickly, but his life took him back to Georgia following the death of his father, and it was there where he got the urge to run for office. He became a state senator in 1963 and in 1970 was elected governor of Georgia.
At the end of a long campaign, I believe I know our people of this state as well as anyone could.
Carter's faith played a central role throughout his political career. As a former deacon and Sunday school teacher in the Baptist Church, he spoke of the need for racial integration, and in his inaugural address as governor, he called for an end to discrimination.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
As governor, Carter quietly began building the framework for a presidential run. So quietly, in fact, many Americans didn't know who he was.
Jimmy who?
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy who?
I don't know who he is.
But through dogged campaigning in the early voting states and a nation eager to reject anyone associated with the scandals of Washington, Carter defeated President Gerald Ford to become the nation's 39th president.
We can be even stronger than before. Let our recent mistakes bring a resurgent commitment to the basic principles of our nation.
On his first day, Carter issued an executive order pardoning hundreds of thousands of men who evaded the military draft during the Vietnam War. He went on to establish formal diplomatic relations with China and brokered the Camp David Accords that helped stabilize relations between Israel and Egypt. And domestically, he created the Departments of Education and Energy. But his 4 years as commander-in-chief came during a tumultuous period in American history. He dealt with an energy crisis that left Americans waiting in long lines to fill up their cars, high inflation, and dwindling support in his own ability to lead.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will.
The final year of Carter's presidency was consumed by the Iranian hostage crisis, when dozens of Americans were held captive in Tehran after extremists took over the U.S. Embassy, only to be freed 444 days later. Shortly after, President Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, and Carter's one term in office came to an end. But Carter's legacy continued decades after leaving office. He founded the Carter Center, which helped mitigate conflicts and promote democracy around the world. In his lifetime, Carter wrote 32 books and notably received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his work on humanitarian issues.
It is clear that global challenges must be met by an emphasis on peace in harmony with others.
He continued to volunteer his time, helping build homes for Habitat for Humanity, along with his wife, Rosalind Carter. Despite all his accomplishments, Carter said marrying her was the, quote, pinnacle of his life.
That was the most important thing in my life. It was happy and joyful and obviously long-lasting.
One of his last public appearances, honoring his late wife at her memorial in November of 2023. Jimmy Carter, the longest living president in U.S. history, remembered for his 4 years in office and more than 40 years of service that came after. Andrew Rafferty, Scripps News, Washington.
And thanks for joining us over the course of this past hour for our special coverage remembering the life of President Jimmy Carter. Reporting from Washington, I'm Joe St. George.